My mother stood up in open court, pointed at me, and told everyone I was insane. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. Welcome to my new story. My mother stared the judge dead in the eye and said I had never been mentally stable, that I was impulsive, volatile, unfit to manage my own money, let alone the inheritance my grandmother left me. I sat there in the Cuyahoga County Courthouse in downtown Cleveland on September 9th, wearing my grandmother's small sapphire studs, and kept my mouth shut. The judge, a woman in her mid-60s with iron gray hair twisted into a bun and half-moon glasses perched low on her nose, listened patiently while my mother's attorney finished his dramatic opening speech. When he finally sat down, the judge turned to him with an expression I recognized immediately. I had seen that look in her courtroom more times than I could count. It was the face she made when something didn't add up. She looked at my mother's young lawyer, a man in a slightly too big navy suit named Colin Pratt, and asked calmly, "Mr. Pratt, are you honestly telling this court you have no idea who this woman is? The woman you're calling mentally incompetent?" Colin blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. He shuffled through his notes. He glanced at me, confused, then back at the judge. My mother's confident smile vanished. In less than 5 seconds, her expression shifted from smug certainty to bewilderment to something pale and close to fear. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in that courtroom. My name is Julia Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant and certified fraud examiner in Cleveland, Ohio. For the past 7 years, I've specialized in one particular kind of crime: financial exploitation of the elderly. My job is to follow money trails in cases where someone close to an older person steals from them: phony powers of attorney, forged checks, mysteriously vanished cash, rewritten wills. I trace transactions, build timelines, and then explain it all in court so a jury can understand exactly how the theft unfolded. I've testified as an expert witness in 40 different cases. 33 ended in convictions. 12 of those testimonies were delivered in Judge Mary Ann Holloway's courtroom, the same judge now staring at my mother's attorney like he'd just handed her a bedtime story instead of a legal argument. Judge Holloway once said on the record that I was, quote, one of the most reliable and meticulous expert witnesses she had encountered in more than 2 decades on the bench. My mother knew none of this. We hadn't spoken in 20 years. Here's what you need to understand about my mother, Caroline Drake. When I was 13, my parents divorced. It was brutal. My father moved to Arizona. Within 3 months, my mother married a man named Richard Drake, who owned a small chain of self-serve car washes in Lucas County, Ohio. Caroline decided her shiny new life had no room for an awkward, grieving teenager. She didn't fight for custody. She didn't request visitation. She didn't protest when the judge granted full custody to my grandmother's father, Evelyn Mercer. After that, my mother never called on my birthday. She mailed exactly 1 Christmas card that first December, then nothing, ever again. I was raised by my grandmother in a modest 1-story house in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Grandma Evelyn had been a 2nd-grade teacher at a public school for 35 years. She never earned much. Her highest annual salary barely topped $40,000. But she was disciplined with every cent. She kept an old metal cash box in her hall closet with neatly labeled envelopes: utilities, groceries, emergencies. She logged every purchase in a spiral notebook. She balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning with a chipped mug of black tea and a slice of toast with strawberry jam. If you asked her where $12.17 went in April of 2003, she could pull out a receipt and show you. She taught me how to read bank statements before she taught me how to parallel park. She had no idea she was training a fraud examiner. She simply believed that money tells the truth when people refuse to. Evelyn died 9 months ago. Heart failure. She was 82 and passed in her sleep in the little house she'd occupied for 45 years. I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. She left everything to me. The house in Cedar Falls, valued at roughly $312,000, a savings account containing $154,800, a small life insurance policy, and a few modest investments. Not a mansion, not a fortune, but a lifetime of careful saving from a woman who never purchased anything she could afford. She earned every penny teaching children how to read and multiply. 3 weeks after her funeral, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment from a law firm in Toledo. The letter was from an attorney named Colin Pratt. My mother was contesting the will. According to the petition, Caroline Drake claimed my grandmother had suffered from significant cognitive decline for years before her death. She alleged I had isolated Evelyn from her family. She accused me of having unduly influenced a vulnerable elder into leaving me the entire estate. This came from a woman who hadn't visited her own mother in 15 years, who never called on birthdays, who walked away from her child without a backward glance. That woman was accusing me of elder abuse. I actually laughed the first time I read it. Then I kept reading and stopped laughing, because Caroline was not merely challenging the will, she was petitioning the court to declare me mentally incompetent and appoint a conservator to control everything my grandmother left behind. The proposed conservator? Caroline Drake. Apparently, she possessed documentation proving I had a long history of mental instability stretching back to my teenage years. I called my boyfriend that night, Jonah Reyes. He teaches high school history. His parents still host Sunday dinners where everyone arrives on time. They display framed family photos arranged chronologically in their hallway. His mother keeps handwritten recipe cards in a wooden box that probably smells like cinnamon and unconditional love. Jonah grew up in a world where people argue and then apologize, not vanish and pretend you never existed. He suggested I call my mother. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe she was drowning in guilt, and this chaotic legal battle was her clumsy way of trying to reconnect. I love Jonah deeply, but sometimes he speaks like someone who was raised inside a greeting card instead of reality. My mother remembered the exact balance of my grandmother's savings, $154,800. That figure appeared multiple times throughout her legal filings. She still cannot recall whether my birthday falls in February or April. Strange how memory sharpens when inheritance is involved. Within 2 weeks, things escalated dramatically. Caroline was not merely challenging the will, she filed a full petition in probate court claiming I was mentally unfit and demanding a conservator be appointed immediately. She requested emergency powers. She wanted my grandmother's accounts frozen. She wanted control. Her evidence was creative. Because she was my legal guardian before she abandoned me, her name remained on much of my old school and medical paperwork. That was enough for her attorney to subpoena records. After she left, I spent roughly 8 months talking to a school counselor about depression and adjustment difficulties, which is exactly what happens when your mother remarries and decides you're not worth keeping. The counselor documented that I was struggling with feelings of rejection and diminished self-worth, standard language for a wounded teenager. Caroline's attorney presented this as evidence of a chronic mental disorder. They also submitted a sworn statement from my stepsister, Brittany Drake. Brittany is 29 now, Richard's daughter from his first marriage. According to her declaration, I had, quote, always seemed volatile and emotionally unstable, and I harbored deep concerns about my ability to manage finances. Brittany was 9 the last time she laid eyes on me. She knows absolutely nothing about the person I became. But here's the reality of legal systems.
Once someone files paperwork like this, truth matters less than procedure. It doesn't matter that the accusations are absurd. It doesn't matter that the evidence is tissue thin. The machine starts grinding forward, and you are compelled to respond. You must hire your own attorney. You must appear in court. You must prove on paper before strangers that you are not the person your mother claims you are. And while you're doing all of that, people whisper. My firm put me on administrative review. Harold Blake, the senior partner who had hired me straight out of my certification program, summoned me to his office. He closed the door gently, sat down, and folded his hands like someone delivering news of a death. He believed me. He assured me the entire situation sounded preposterous. Then he explained the practical reality. The firm couldn't continue putting me on the stand as an expert witness while my mental competency was being challenged in another courtroom. This wasn't about
It didn't take long to uncover why she was doing this. Richard's car wash business was failing. People don't feed quarters into those bays like they once did, not when touchless drive-thrus and cheap home detailing kits are everywhere. He owed nearly $300,000 to lenders. Their house carried a second mortgage. Credit cards were exhausted. My grandmother's estate wasn't about justice or family for them. It was about rescue. But I still didn't grasp the full scope of what they had already done. Not yet. Jonah and I had our first serious fight about 2 weeks into this ordeal. His mother had telephoned him, her voice thick with concern, asking whether there was anything he should know about my past, any diagnoses, any hospitalizations, any buried secrets. He arrived that evening quieter than usual and eventually asked why I wouldn't simply undergo a psychological evaluation, prove I was fine, shut everything down. I told him that wasn't the point. The point was that I shouldn't have to submit my mind for examination because a woman who discarded me decided she wanted my inheritance. He said something about how, from the outside, my refusal looked suspicious, something about smoke and fire. I stared at him for a long moment and asked him to leave. He left. That night I sat alone in my living room studying a framed photograph of my grandmother from my college graduation. She was 74 in that picture, standing beside me on the campus lawn, beaming like I'd just been appointed chair of the Federal Reserve. All I'd done was earn an accounting degree. To her, it was vindication for every sacrifice she'd made. She used to say, numbers are stubborn, people lie, memories distort, feelings shift, but if you follow the money, it reveals what actually happened. So I decided to follow the money. 2 years before she died, Evelyn had added me as a joint account holder on her primary checking and savings accounts. She explained it was just in case she ever grew too weary to wait in bank lines, so I could help manage her bills. At the time, I assumed it was simple convenience. Looking back, I believe she sensed something or someone might create problems later. From my laptop, I accessed her accounts and downloaded every statement from the final 2 years of her life. I constructed a spreadsheet. I cataloged every deposit, every withdrawal. Patterns emerged almost immediately. And that's when I discovered the first fracture in my mother's story. During the final 10 months before my grandmother died, there were 9 cash withdrawals that matched nothing in her established spending habits. No utilities, no grocery stores, no pharmacy visits. Just substantial, in-person cash withdrawals ranging from $3,500 to $11,200. Total $61,430. Every single withdrawal occurred within 72 hours of a documented visit from Caroline Drake. My grandmother had developed mild memory difficulties about a year before she passed, misplacing keys, forgetting an acquaintance's name, but she could still complete her crossword puzzles in ink and debate politics with me for hours. She wasn't incompetent, she was vulnerable, and my mother recognized that. The woman accusing me of exploiting an elderly relative had been systematically draining her own mother's accounts for nearly a year. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a pot of coffee, and I did exactly what I'm trained to do. I investigated. The bank withdrawals were only the surface. Evelyn had always been scrupulous with her paperwork, but during her final year, some of her files had fallen into disarray. Initially, I attributed this to age and exhaustion. Now I wondered if someone had been encouraging the chaos. That weekend, I drove 5 hours to Cedar Falls to examine her house more thoroughly. Jonah offered to accompany me, but the tension between us remained raw. I told him I needed to do this alone. The moment I pushed open the front door, the house enveloped me with her presence. Lavender cleaner, aged paper, the faint trace of lemon furniture polish. I spent 3 hours combing through her filing cabinet, desk drawers, shoe boxes, even the pockets of her winter coats. Bills, letters, insurance documents, old birthday cards. Some gaps, some peculiar duplicates, nothing that fully explained the withdrawals. Then I remembered something I should have considered immediately: her safe deposit box. 5 years earlier, following a burglary scare in the neighborhood, she had added my name to a box at Cedar Falls Community Bank. I'd accompanied her once to store some jewelry inside, then completely forgot it existed. The following morning, I went to the bank, presented my identification, and signed the access log. A teller escorted me to a small, private room and brought out a long, narrow metal box. Inside were the items I anticipated: her wedding ring, the jewelry she wore only on special occasions, a couple of matured savings bonds, her birth certificate, and her social security card. And one thing I had never seen before: a brown, leather-bound journal. The cover was softened at the edges from years of handling. My grandmother's precise handwriting marked the inside front page: E.M. Personal Notes. The entries were dated. The first was written 14 months before she died. The last was composed 6 weeks before she passed. My grandmother knew exactly what was happening to her. She wrote it all down. The very first entry in that leather journal nearly shattered me. In her tidy cursive, Evelyn described how my mother had called out of the blue after more than a decade of silence. Caroline's voice was syrupy and soft, brimming with apologies and declarations of change and desperate pleas to reconnect with family. My grandmother wrote that she didn't believe it, not entirely, but she was old, she was tired, and some stubborn part of her wanted to believe that people could mature even late in life. From there, the entries grew darker. Caroline visited in August. She arrived with flowers and a sorrowful story about a crisis with one of Richard's car washes. "Just until we get back on our feet," she'd said, requesting a $2,000 loan. Evelyn gave it to her. In October, Caroline returned alone. Now, Richard was supposedly ill. Hospital bills, insurance complications, they were drowning. She needed $4,000. Evelyn wrote that she hesitated, then surrendered the money anyway. In December, Caroline appeared with Richard beside her. They were all warmth and concern. They told Evelyn they worried about her managing everything alone. They wanted to ease her burden. They placed a stack of documents before her and explained it would simply make helping with bills more convenient. Evelyn signed. In the journal entry from that day, she wrote that her head felt stuffed with cotton, that focusing had become difficult, that she wasn't entirely certain what she had agreed to. 2 weeks later, on a clearer morning, she reviewed the documents again. She discovered she'd signed a durable power of attorney. On paper, Caroline now controlled her accounts. Evelyn wrote that she felt foolish, humiliated. She wrote that she couldn't bring herself to confess what had happened. That was the part that destroyed me. The woman who could account for every dollar she'd spent in 20 years was too ashamed to admit her own mother had deceived her. She worried more about appearing weak to me than about the stolen money. So instead of calling me, she did the one thing she had always trusted. She documented every visit, every loan, every lie Caroline told, every occasion Richard happened to be present when cash disappeared from her account. Spreadsheets don't lie. Neither does ink on paper when the right person holds the pen. The final entry was addressed to me by name.
She apologized. She wrote that she had tried repeatedly to tell me what was happening, but every time she opened her mouth, the words lodged in her throat. She said she knew her daughter, my mother, would pursue the money after she was gone. I can't stop her from trying, she wrote, but I can leave you the proof. You understand numbers better than anyone I've ever known. Use them. Fight. You're stronger than I ever was, Julia. That's how I know you'll win. I sat on the cold tile floor of that small bank room with the safe deposit box open beside me and wept until my eyes ached. The branch manager passed once, glanced in, and politely pretended to see nothing. When I finished crying, I did what Evelyn would have done. I went to work. The power of attorney was not forged in the conventional sense. The signature was genuine. I recognized that slanted E, the distinctive loop of her M in Mercer. She had signed while confused and pressured. What was fraudulent was everything surrounding it. The notarization at the bottom bore the stamp and signature of a man named Luis K. Herrera, Notary Public, State of Ohio. I researched him that night. Herrera had surrendered his commission and retired in 2018. The document in my possession was dated June 2023. Someone had unearthed an old stamp and applied it to a new document. Careless, lazy, and unquestionably criminal. In my profession, that isn't a family misunderstanding. That's felony fraud. Next, I investigated Richard Drake's history the way I would examine any subject in my cases. Public records, probate files, property transactions, old business registrations. I extracted what I could from online databases, then called in favors from colleagues in other cities. What I uncovered made my stomach turn.
Richard's first wife had died in 2011. His mother passed in 2016. In both estates, the files contained complaints, letters from relatives, notes from attorneys, regarding irregularities and missing funds. In both cases, Richard had held power of attorney before they died. In both cases, bank balances had plummeted sharply in the final year, far exceeding what medical care or living expenses would justify. No one had ever pushed hard enough to trigger charges. The amounts weren't enormous. The families were fractured. People were grieving and frightened and didn't know how to challenge someone who claimed the nursing home consumed everything. But the pattern was unmistakable. My mother hadn't stumbled into a desperate man with terrible luck. She had married someone who knew precisely how to strip an elderly person's life down to bare walls and empty accounts. This time, they had chosen someone who could recognize the pattern. The following morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Margaret Chu. She was 51, a former federal prosecutor who had spent a decade imprisoning white-collar criminals before transitioning to private civil practice. Margaret was not warm. She was not conversational. She listened. I presented everything: the journal, photographs of key entries, the bank statements, the fraudulent notarization, the warning signs surrounding Richard's deceased relatives. I explained Caroline's petition to have me declared mentally incompetent. She remained silent for several seconds after I finished. Then she said, "This isn't merely a will contest, Julia. This is elder financial exploitation at minimum. The forged notarization implicates forgery and possibly mail and wire fraud. Depending on what else surfaces, perhaps more." She asked what outcome I wanted. I didn't hesitate. "I want them stopped," I said, "completely. I don't just want to preserve the house and savings. I want them documented. I want them locked into their lies under oath, and I want the judge to recognize exactly who they are before she discovers who I am." Over the phone, I heard something shift in Margaret's tone, a small, satisfied exhalation. "Good," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that." The court scheduled a hearing for September 9th. That gave me just under 7 weeks. I approached it like any complex case file. I constructed timelines, one tracking Caroline's reappearance in Evelyn's life, one mapping bank withdrawals, one chronicling Richard's previous family losses. I cross-referenced names, dates, and amounts. I obtained nursing home cost reports, county property tax records, and anything else that might support or undermine my suspicions. Then I did something that felt counterintuitive. We filed the blandest possible response to my mother's petition. Margaret drafted it, 3 pages total. I formally denied being mentally incompetent. I stated that I disputed their claims regarding my relationship with my grandmother. I requested a full evidentiary hearing. We attached nothing else. No journal excerpts, no bank records, no indication that we knew about the power of attorney or the notary issue, just enough to keep the case alive. The following day, my mother's attorney, Pratt, telephoned Margaret. She activated the speakerphone and reclined in her chair while he spoke. "Is that really your client's entire defense? Just, I deny it?" Margaret's voice remained smooth. "Miss Mercer looks forward to presenting evidence at the hearing, Mr. Pratt. Your side carries the burden on the incompetency claim. We'll respond accordingly." "There's nothing here," he said, as though he couldn't believe his fortune. "That's your assessment," Margaret replied, and disconnected. If Colin believed I was arrogant, or foolish, or simply too damaged to mount a defense, I welcomed the assumption. It's easier to guide someone into a trap when they believe the door stands wide open. 2 weeks before the hearing, Colin scheduled my deposition. That's standard procedure. Before trial, the opposing side seats you in a conference room under oath, activates a camera, and asks every question they can devise. Most people talk excessively in depositions. I did not. He asked where I attended school. I told him. He asked my degree. Accounting, I replied. He asked my occupation. Forensic accountant. When he attempted to probe deeper, which cases, what testimony, I answered in brief, factual statements and let my attorney object when questions wandered. He inquired about my mental health history. I explained I had consulted a school counselor for several months as a teenager following my parents' divorce. "Any diagnoses?" he asked. "No formal diagnosis," I said, which was accurate. The notes referenced adjustment difficulties. He kept attempting to draw me out, to speculate, to interpret my emotions as something more ominous. I didn't engage. I simply refused to fill the silences. On the laptop screen in the corner, I could observe my mother watching from her living room. The video feed was divided, Jana's face, mine, and a smaller window showing Caroline and Brittany seated on their couch. Initially, Caroline appeared tense, restless, perhaps expecting me to erupt. As the hours dragged on and I remained flat, quiet, and unimpressed, her expression transformed. She looked pleased, as though I were confirming her narrative. She had no idea that for 7 years I had sat across from bankers who laundered cartel money, from executives who embezzled pensions, from relatives who drained their grandparents dry and guided them step by step through their own crimes using nothing but organized documents and a measured voice. She had no idea that the muted, colorless version of me in that deposition was a performance. I've never enjoyed acting, but I won't deny it. That was among my finest work. A week before the hearing, Margaret forwarded an email from Colin's office. Brittany Drake wanted to meet with me. My stepsister. The same stepsister whose sworn statement described how unstable and erratic I was, supposedly, as a child. My immediate counsel was to decline. It could be a trap, Margaret warned. They might be fishing for something you say off the record that they can distort, or Brittany might simply be delivering her father's message. But I kept replaying her expression from the deposition feed. She hadn't spoken, yet her body communicated volumes. When Colin mentioned Richard's name, her jaw tightened. When Caroline laughed at one of Colin's remarks about my supposed fragility, Brittany's gaze dropped to the floor. That wasn't loyalty, that resembled shame.
I told Margaret I wanted the meeting, with precautions. Public location, no recordings, nothing without my attorney's awareness. We agreed on a chain coffee shop near the interstate in Sandusky, roughly halfway between Cleveland and Toledo, neutral territory. Brittany was nothing like I had imagined. In my memory, she remained 9 years old, shy and quiet, clutching her father's hand. The woman who entered the coffee shop was in her late 20s, pale and gaunt, with deep hollows under her eyes and a nervous habit of scratching her thumbnail until the surrounding skin reddened. She ordered black coffee. It sat untouched before her. She apologized almost immediately. "I'm sorry about that statement," she said, her voice low. "I didn't write it. My dad did. He sat at the kitchen table and read it aloud and instructed me to sign it. He said if I refused, he would make things very difficult." I asked what difficult meant. She studied the table for a long moment, then carefully pushed back her sweater sleeve just enough to reveal a faint, ropey scar along the inside of her left wrist. "He doesn't strike when he's angry. He breaks things, he screams, he shoves. Then he behaves as though nothing happened." She inhaled deeply and began describing her mother, Geraldine. Geraldine resided in a Pennsylvania nursing home, genuine dementia, the kind where she forgot names, dates, the faces of her own children. Richard held power of attorney. He managed all her finances. By her death in 2016, almost nothing remained in her estate. The house was gone, savings depleted. A cousin raised questions. There were heated phone calls, but Richard blamed everything on exorbitant care costs. At 21, Brittany believed him. Years later, after establishing some distance, she had begun doing what I do professionally. She examined the numbers. The totals the nursing home provided didn't match what had vanished from Geraldine's accounts. When she confronted Richard, he went very still, very quiet, and then very cruel. I wouldn't specify what he said. I didn't need to. I already understood what predators do when someone reaches for their mask. "Your grandmother isn't the first," Brittany said finally. "My mother, I'm not certain, but there were strange circumstances when she died too. I just know I can't sit in that courtroom again and pretend I don't see what's happening." I asked her why she was risking this now. She shrugged, but tears glistened in her eyes. "I don't—"
"From that place on 117th, he said as I approached. "The one you love, the curry that's basically molten lava." Inside was Penang curry, extra spicy as always, and sticky rice. He looked exhausted and remorseful. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I said, that smoke and fire comment. I let my parents' anxieties contaminate my judgment, and I treated you like a suspect instead of a partner. That wasn't fair." I didn't make it easy for him. I handed him the journal, the bank printouts, my notes on the fraudulent notarization, and the outline of Richard's pattern with his mother and first wife. He sat at my small kitchen table and read every page. When he finished, he didn't reach for me. He didn't resume apologizing. He simply looked at me in a way he'd never had before. Not as though I were fragile, not as though I were in trouble, as though I were dangerous, in the best possible sense. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you in that courtroom," I said. "I need you to witness what I actually do when I'm not just coming home venting about spreadsheets." He nodded once. "Then I'll be there." The night before the hearing, I drove to Cedar Falls one final time. Snow had fallen the previous day. The cemetery was a patchwork of white drifts and dark stone. I parked on the lane nearest Evelyn's grave and switched off the engine. I didn't step out. I simply sat there, watching my breath fog the windshield, studying the faint outline of her headstone beneath the snow. She used to say that people can dispute stories, but they cannot dispute mathematics that's been verified twice. "Let the numbers speak," she would tell me. "They don't care who gets embarrassed." Tomorrow, I decided, I would let them roar. September 9th. Cuyahoga County Courthouse, 8:32 a.m. I arrived early. Of course I did. I wore a plain navy blazer over a white blouse and dark slacks, not because Caroline had posted herself in something similar on social media, though I had noticed and rolled my eyes, but because it was the sort of outfit no one remembers afterward. I wasn't there to be memorable. I was there to be undeniable. The probate courtroom was smaller than the criminal courts where I typically testified. 4th floor, room 4B. Light wood benches. A single flag behind the judge's bench. No jury box, just the judge, a court reporter, and a scattering of people waiting for brief guardianship hearings. Jonah sat in the back row, flanked by 2 colleagues from my firm who had taken personal days to attend. I hadn't requested their presence. They had come regardless. Margaret sat beside me at the respondents' table, her file folder far thicker than Colin Pratt could possibly imagine. At 9:07, my mother made her entrance. Caroline walked in like someone arriving fashionably late to brunch, just enough hurry to appear apologetic, just enough composure to command attention. She wore a navy blazer nearly identical to mine, tailored precisely to her figure, and a carefully arranged expression of wounded dignity. On the lapel of that blazer was a piece of jewelry that drove the air from my lungs more forcefully than anything else had. A small silver locket, oval-shaped, with a tiny chip along the edge. Evelyn's locket. My grandmother had worn it every Sunday the way other women wore wedding rings. I had assumed it remained in the safe deposit box. Apparently, during one of those reconciliation visits, my mother had slipped it into her own pocket. The forged documents, the lies, the petitions to have me declared incompetent, I could analyze those with professional detachment, but seeing that stolen locket catching the fluorescent light of the courtroom ignited something hot and clean in my chest. Anger, certainly, and beneath it, something steadier. Resolve. Richard followed a step behind her, wearing his usual mask of solemn concern. If you didn't know him, you'd think he was exactly what he pretended to be, a steady, worried husband simply trying to do right by a troubled family. He offered a small nod toward the bench before sitting beside Caroline, as though he and the judge were partners in maintaining order. Brittany slipped in last. She didn't look at me, she didn't look at her father. She sat at the far end of the row behind the petitioner's table, folded into herself, eyes fixed on her hands. At the other table, Colin Pratt shuffled his legal pad, checked his phone one final time, and tugged at the sleeves of his oversized suit jacket. He still resembled a graduate student who had wandered into the wrong room and decided to pretend he belonged. For half a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Court is now session, the Honorable Judge Mary Ann Holloway presiding. We rose. Judge Holloway stepped through the side door, took her seat, and slid her reading glasses into place. She glanced down at the thin case file before her, then lifted her eyes toward the petitioner's table. Then her gaze shifted to me. There was a tiny pause, a narrowing of her eyes. Her head tilted a fraction of an inch. Recognition. She didn't speak my name, she didn't smile, but I knew in that split second that she remembered exactly who I was and why I had appeared in her courtroom a dozen times before. Colin Pratt launched into his opening like he was reciting from a template. For roughly 12 minutes, Colin painted Caroline as a heartbroken mother, estranged from her daughter not by choice, but by old misunderstandings, who had nevertheless never stopped caring. He described my grandmother as a frail, isolated woman whose only connection to the outside world was a granddaughter with documented emotional issues and a long history of instability. He brandished printouts of my old school counseling notes as though they constituted a psychiatric diagnosis. He never once uttered the words forensic accountant. He never mentioned that I had testified as an expert witness in financial exploitation cases for years. He hadn't bothered to enter my name in a basic legal database. To him, I was simply an accountant. When he finally sat down, Judge Holloway looked at Caroline. "Does the petitioner wish to speak?" she asked. Caroline rose slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer with deliberate precision. At first, her voice was soft, measured. She spoke of her concern for me, her fear that my grandmother's true wishes weren't being honored. Then something in her slipped. Her tone sharpened, the volume climbed. She turned fully toward me and pointed. She called me sick, dangerous, not right in the head. She declared I had always been unstable, that I was easily manipulated and completely unfit to manage money. She insisted allowing me to control my grandmother's estate would be a tragedy. I didn't flinch. I kept my hands folded on the table, my expression neutral, and let her words dissolve into the air. Judge Holloway permitted her to finish without much as a raised eyebrow. When Caroline finally exhausted herself and sat down, Judge Holloway turned back to Colin. "Counsel," she said, very calmly, "are you truly unaware of who your client is describing as mentally incompetent?" Colin blinked, visibly rattled. Miss Mercer is an accountant, Your Honor. She works for a private firm in Cleveland." The judge held his gaze for a long moment, then shifted her attention to Margaret. "Counsel for the respondent." Margaret stood. She didn't launch into a speech. Her voice was clipped and precise. "Your Honor, we would like to submit evidence that may significantly alter the court's understanding of the circumstances surrounding Miss Mercer's inheritance and her mother's petition." "Proceed," Judge Holloway said. Margaret opened her folder and handed a thick, tabbed packet to the clerk, who delivered it to Colin. Another copy went up to the bench. "We'll begin with the financial records from Miss Evelyn Mercer's accounts." She walked through the timeline as though it were any other case. 9 substantial cash withdrawals, totaling $61,430 in the final 10 months of Evelyn's life, each made in person, each occurring within 72 hours of a documented visit from Caroline Drake. Initially, Colin's expression remained politely vacant. He still believed this was some accounting discrepancy, or that we were building toward a simple misunderstanding claim. But then Margaret addressed the power of attorney. She placed a copy on the display, indicated the notary stamp at the bottom, and handed up a 1-page certification from the Ohio Secretary of State's office. "This document purports to have been notarized by Luis K. Herrera on June 12th of last year," she said. "However, Mr. Herrera surrendered his commission and retired as a notary in August of 2018. The seal on this document is authentic, but it was applied years after he possessed legal authority to stamp anything." Colin visibly paled. Margaret didn't pause. She withdrew the brown leather journal, held it up for the record, and then read selected entries aloud. Evelyn's words filled the silent room. Her confusion, her guilt, her fear that she had been manipulated into surrendering control of her accounts to a daughter she didn't entirely trust. Her meticulous notes documenting every loan, every visit, every occasion Caroline or Richard said, "Just sign here, Mom, it's easier this way." You could have heard a pin strike the floor. I watched my mother as those entries were read. Her expression shifted from faint puzzlement to disbelief, and then to something resembling outrage, not at what she had done, but at the fact that it had been recorded. Caroline wasn't remorseful. She was offended that her victim had kept notes.
Richard was more difficult to read. He sat completely motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed on a point just above the judge's head. That's what someone looks like when they've witnessed this scene before and recognize how it typically concludes. Margaret finished by establishing the pattern. She summarized the irregularities in Richard's first wife's estate, the missing funds from his mother Geraldine's accounts, the way balances had collapsed in the final year of each woman's life. She noted that federal authorities had been notified, and a formal complaint was being prepared for suspected mail fraud, wire fraud, and elder financial exploitation. When she sat down, silence filled the courtroom. Judge Holloway turned to Colin. "Counsel?" she asked. "Response?" He swallowed, then requested a brief recess to confer with his client. 10 minutes, the judge said, and departed the bench. Colin approached Caroline and leaned down. His lips moved rapidly, quietly. I couldn't discern the words, but I could observe their impact. Her anger flickered, then confusion, then something approaching horror. He was explaining who I was. He was telling her how many times I had testified in this building, how the judge already knew my work, how the woman she had just labeled incompetent was, in fact, the person other attorneys retained to explain fraud to judges and juries. For the first time in nearly 20 years, my mother truly looked at me. Not past me, not around me, at me. I didn't smirk. I didn't look away. I simply met her eyes and waited. When the judge returned and called us back to order, Colin rose, his voice noticeably unsteady. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, my client wishes to withdraw her petition." Judge Holloway shook her head. "No," she said. "Given what I've heard and reviewed, I am not inclined to allow this matter to simply vanish from the record." She looked directly at Caroline. "This court finds that the petition to declare Miss Mercer mentally incompetent is without merit and was filed in bad faith. It is denied with prejudice. Additionally, all materials presented today will be referred to the county prosecutor's office and a copy forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for further review." She turned to me briefly. "Miss Mercer, this court appreciates your patience." Then she struck her gavel once. And that was it. No shouting match, no dramatic exits, just documents, numbers, and a judge who understood precisely what those numbers meant. That's how justice operates most of the time, not with fireworks, but with file folders. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. It genuinely matters. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe and leave a like. That's how content like this finds its audience. Now let me tell you what happened after we walked out of that courtroom. The FBI moved faster than I anticipated. 3 days after the hearing, I received a call from Special Agent Laura Chen at the Cleveland field office. Her voice was brisk, no nonsense. She had reviewed the packet Margaret submitted. Then she had pulled Richard's financial history spanning 15 years. She had uncovered more than I had. On October 3rd, federal agents arrested Caroline and Richard at their home. The indictment ran 19 pages. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, multiple counts tied to my grandmother, several more connected to her mother and his late wife. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Pennsylvania reopened the file on Geraldine's estate. Forensic accountants excavated old bank records and discovered roughly $212,000 in unexplained transfers during the 3 years preceding her death. Geraldine had owned her house free and clear. She had possessed a solid pension and modest savings. By the time she died, nearly every dollar had been drained. He had done it to his own mother first. Then he married mine and expanded the operation. Brittany agreed to cooperate. She sat with federal agents and disclosed everything she knew: how her father managed money, what he had said after his mother died, the night she confronted him and ended up with that scar on her wrist. In exchange for complete, truthful testimony, the government granted her immunity. I don't know if that strikes everyone as just. I know this much: she had lived under his control her entire life. I don't believe prison would have repaired in her more than the truth already had. The trial lasted slightly over 2 weeks. I testified early and then returned to my own caseload. I've sat through enough courtrooms to understand that reliving every detail doesn't make a verdict more likely. But I was in the gallery when the jury returned. Caroline was found guilty on 3 federal counts related to fraud and exploitation in my grandmother's case. The judge sentenced her to 4.5 years in federal facility, with a requirement that she serve at least 85% before becoming eligible for supervised release. She was ordered to pay full restitution of $61,430 to Evelyn's estate, plus interest and penalties, though I doubt she'll ever see the end of that obligation. Richard was found guilty on 8 counts. The judge sentenced him to 8 years and 2 months in federal prison. The government seized what remained of his business assets. The wash cars were sold. The proceeds went first to creditors and then into a restitution pool for his victims. The house went to auction. Their country club lifestyle had already disintegrated once earlier when the dues stopped being paid. By the time sentencing concluded, almost nothing remained of the life they constructed on other people's savings. About 2 months after Caroline reported to prison, a letter arrived at Margaret's office bearing my name. I didn't open it. I slid it across her desk. She read it and summarized it in 3 sentences. 6 pages, excuses, self-pity, considerable discussion of having no choice, no actual apology, not remotely close. She asked if I wanted a copy. I told her to shred it. Some paper trails are worth following to their conclusion. Some are just debris you don't need to carry into your home. My grandmother's estate finally closed the following spring. I kept the house in Cedar Falls. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Too much of her lives in those walls, the notches on the kitchen door frame where she measured my height, the dent in the dining table where she once dropped a calculator and laughed until tears streamed down her face. On quiet weekends, Jonah and I drive out there. We sit on the front porch with coffee, our feet propped on the railing, gazing at the same street Evelyn watched for 40 decades. Sometimes I balance my own checkbook at that porch table, in a small, stubborn act of tribute. I kept the journal, too. Not as evidence, that purpose has been served. I kept it because it's the last thing she ever wrote, because it preserves her voice on paper, frightened and embarrassed, and still methodical, still fighting in the only way she knew. Jonah proposed in December, not at some scenic overlook or candlelit rooftop, but in the booth where we shared our very first date, a chain Italian restaurant off the highway, the one with mediocre pasta, unlimited breadsticks, and inexplicably happy memories. He slid a ring box across the sticky table between 2 half-finished bowls of fettuccine. I said yes before he completed the question. My grandmother would have approved. She always insisted I needed someone steady, someone who wouldn't flee when life grew complicated. Jonah walked directly into complicated and asked for a chair. My firm reinstated me the week after the incompetency petition was denied. Harold summoned me to his office and apologized personally for sidelining me, even temporarily. I told him I understood. Then I asked for my files back. My first case after returning involved an 83-year-old retired nurse in Akron, whose grandson had quietly skimmed $94,000 from her retirement over 3 years. We traced the transfers, we tracked the cash withdrawals, we constructed the timeline. She recovered every cent. He received 4 years in state prison. I slept better that week than I had in months. People love to claim revenge is about rage, about inflicting pain on the person who wounded you. From where I sit, it's something quieter. It's about restoring weight to the side of the scale that someone tried to tilt. It's about reminding those who believe themselves clever enough to prey on the vulnerable that numbers don't take sides. They simply reveal truth. It's about demonstrating that patience, documentation, and an obsessive attention to detail will defeat greed and manipulation over the long run. My mother interpreted silence as weakness. She assumed that because I didn't immediately confront her and scream, I was broken. She believed that since she had walked away from me at 13 and bled other people dry along the way, she could do it again and I would crumble. She forgot who raised me. Not a woman who shouted, a woman who preserved every receipt, balanced every account, and believed that somewhere a ledger was always being kept. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you want to hear more true stories from my life and from my work, there's another video waiting for you on your screen right now.